Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Kevin Dorst. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at MIT. He works on epistemology, logic, language, and their intersections. So, Dr. Dorst, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
So, we're going to focus mostly on epistemology today. So this is, I guess, one of the oldest disciplines in philosophy, I think. What kinds of questions does it deal with?
Yeah, so that's a hard contested question, but at a first pass, epistemology is the study of knowledge, and so it asks questions about what is knowledge and when can we know things? Classical questions are questions about skepticism, for example, sort of can we know anything at all? Also related are questions of what's the structure of knowledge? Does knowledge require certain sorts of the right sort of evidence or the right sort of connection to the world? Here's like a simple example that's easy to get in the mindset of the sort of questions. Here's a question. Do you know that there's an apple in my office? You might say yes. Look, there's one right there. You can see it. But as every epistemologist knows, it's good to have props around. This is a fake apple, right? So it looks like, well, maybe you were wrong, right? Maybe you didn't know. Certainly, you didn't think that this was going to be a plastic apple. On the other hand, you should also have apples around. This is a real apple, for example. So question, did you know in that case? It was true that there was an apple in my office. It was right here. You believed it because you saw this other one back there.
Right.
That's the questions epistemologists classically worry about. That's one brand of epistemology that goes back to thousands of years. There's a different, somewhat more recent brand, which is closer to what I tend to focus on, which is more questions about rationality and how rational people respond to evidence and update their beliefs. So they're less concerned with sometimes concerned with knowledge in particular, but more generally concerned with how does a responsible person who's like holding their beliefs together well, what sort of evidence, how do they think about evidence? What are the sort of structural features they have in responding to evidence? Do they respond in biased or unbiased ways? Those sorts of questions. So I'm sure we'll get into some of that as we go, but those are some of the big questions. Knowledge and rationality broadly construed.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to the kinds of questions you're interested in, what are some of the most prominent approaches out there nowadays?
Yeah, so this is one area in which, although epistemology is old, some of the way it's done right now is fairly new. So there's a subfield, which is the subfield I work on, which is sometimes called formal epistemology, which is formal not in the sort of formal attire sense, but formal in the sense of technical or mathematical. And so in informal epistemology, a lot of the approaches are broadly speaking mathematical or logical in the mathematical sense of logic. People use tools from mathematics like probability theory to try to analyze rational belief, for example, or use tools from logic to try to look at things about the structure of knowledge or the structure of rational belief. So a lot of what people in this sort of subfield do is they do something that looks a little bit like mathematics, a little bit like psychology and cognitive science at times. We're building models, sometimes abstractly, sometimes a model of a very particular case, but these are mathematical models that make predictions and claims about what, say, knowledge you have in various situations, or what is rational to believe in various situations and how it could change depending on what evidence comes in. So that's a sort of, at a very high level, a very prominent approach that I would say in the last 20, 30, 40 years has taken off in epistemology. It's not the only approach. There are many other approaches to epistemology, but that's the one that I think about most.
Mm-hmm. I would like to ask you, what is a belief? Because even recently I had perhaps 2 or 3 philosophers on the show with whom I discussed epistemology and philosophy of mind, and we talked about the concept of belief. And if I'm right, it seems that there's lots of disagreement about it, right?
That's right. Get philosophers in the room, you'll have 18 different opinions about pretty much anything. But one of them is, yeah, especially for foundational concepts of a field like knowledge or belief. I've been talking about rational belief, but we can talk about belief generically. Classically, in some sense, a belief is an answer to a question. If if you ask me when my birthday is, I say it's in July, then in some sense I've told you a belief I have about my birthday, maybe knowledge I have about my birthday. What's one of the things that's broadly contested is how strong of an answer it needs to be. So classically, beliefs in the philosopher's sense are sometimes called outright beliefs or full beliefs. They're often having in mind a very strong notion of belief, something like being sure. Like, what do you really believe? Sort of, do you really believe in God, or do you really believe, that study is a good study, or do you really believe your birthday is in July? And yes, I do. But and that's where a lot of the something like sort of the things you take for granted in your reasoning, or something like that, is how philosophers often talk about belief. There's a more recent group of people, myself included, who tend to think there's certainly a notion of certainty or being sure or taking for granted that does play that sort of role, but it's not obvious that that's the notion that we are talking about when we talk about what our beliefs are. Rather, there's, from a bunch of different angles, different bits of evidence to think that there's a sense in which belief is weak. It's an attitude you can have towards things when it doesn't take that much evidence or that much reason to believe in order to go ahead and believe it. So like the examples that motivate this is just sort of often natural language discussions about what people believe. I ask, who do you think's gonna win the Republican nomination for president in 2024? Or I said think there, but I could have said believe slightly more. Who do you believe is gonna win the presidential nomination from the Republican Party? And it's natural to say Trump, or natural to say DeSantis. Of course, you're not sure, right? It's 2 years out, and you've got a decent amount of uncertainty. The prediction markets put it at 40 to 50% for Trump and 40 to 50% for DeSantis. So like you're not super confident. You wouldn't bet your life on it. But since if I ask you what do you think or what do you believe, you say yeah, I believe Trump will be elected or Trump will be nominated. Sorry, and that's a notion of belief that's sort of fairly weak and easy to think that you don't need that much evidence to endorse. That's the controversial take, but it's sometimes called belief is weak, and that's the sort of attitude that some of us think beliefs are something like your guesses, your best guesses in response to a question, and sometimes a guess can be based on relatively little evidence as opposed to very strong evidence.
You mentioned guesses there, and I think it's important also in epistemology, particularly to distinguish between different phenomena, like, for example, guesses, assertions, and belief. So what's the distinction there, particularly between assertion and belief?
Yeah, so another controversial question. I'll give you a controversial answer. Most people tend to think, so assertions at a first pass are the things we say in conversation that sort of update the conversation, update the common ground, what we're discussing, what we're taking for granted. Whereas beliefs are sort of things in our head that, maybe sort of are the inner analog of assertion or something like that, what we think to ourselves, what we say to ourselves. That's the first pass. And standardly, if you think belief is strong, then you think, the sort of view in which belief requires being sure or something like that, and you think, most people think belief and assertion is sort of in parallel. Inside your head, you believe. When you say it out loud, you assert. And those are sort of equal, on a par acts. One's cognitive, one's speech act. Mm-hmm. If you're in the business of saying belief is weak, a lot of people think belief is weak. We believe things all the time that we're not willing to assert, that we don't claim to know. And there's a lot of the evidence that belief is weak comes from these sorts of contrasts between what we are willing to believe and what we're willing to assert. So It's perfectly coherent to say, I believe Trump will be the nominee, but I'm not sure. Or I believe he'll be the nominee, but I don't know. it's very weird to say Trump will be the nominee, but I'm not sure. Or Trump will be the nominee, but I don't know if he will. So like outright, the contrast is between saying I believe Trump will be the nominee, but hedging in some way, versus Trump will be the nominee and hedging in some way. So a lot of people think because of that, belief is weak and assertion is strong. To assert, you need to be sure or to have knowledge or something like that. Whereas to believe, you only need to have it be your best guess. So that's a common view about the relation between assertion and belief. Even more controversially, I tend to think that assertions can often be weak as well. And this is, might take us too far afield, but there's all sorts of times when in low stakes contexts, we can say things that we're not very confident of. You ask me, like, who's going to be the nominee? I say, Trump's got this in the bag. Or, it'll be Trump, come on. That's an assertion. Of course, it might be common ground that I don't know that it's too far in the future for me to be certain of or anything like that. And still, I can go ahead and say it. And so we can go into some of the ins and outs of why you might, the big dialectic back and forth between whether assertion is strong and what to make sense of the little bits of data, linguistic data I mentioned, where it's weird to combine a belief with or an assertion with lack of certainty in some sense. And so hard to know exactly what to say with it, but roughly those are some of the options. Assertion is either stronger than or a little bit weak as belief, depending on exactly how we go between those arguments.
Right. And when is belief justified? I know that's something that people in epistemology also discuss a lot, and probably there's people that put forth different criteria to determine that a belief is justified or not. But what do you think about it?
Yeah, so what you say about this is gonna relate pretty closely to what you say about how strong an attitude belief is, and sort of in some sense, is belief weak, or is it sort of thing that is requires being sure or something like that? So starting from the top, from the strongest and the most demanding sense, some people say belief is just, or the relevant sense of belief for philosophers is probability 1 given your evidence. So you think, well, you got some evidence, which is a little bit hard to characterize exactly what your evidence is, but it's sort of like the things you know, the sort of things you can take for granted or you're justified in taking for granted, maybe sort of things you're perceiving right now. It's part of your evidence that there's a tree behind me and that there's an apple in the room, right? That sort of thing. And that evidence will make some claims certain and some things probable, but not certain. So maybe it's certain given your evidence that there's a tree or a tree-like thing behind me. It's not a fake tree. I won't let you know. Whereas some things are merely probable, like, okay, if I got a tree, then I probably have, a watering vase somewhere so that I can water the tree. But that's not certain given your evidence because you can't see one. So one view says, a belief is justified if it's certain given your evidence. A weaker view, one that's more amenable to the belief is weak view, says, no, it's just got to be probable enough given your evidence. This is sometimes called the Lockean thesis or a Lockean view of belief after John Locke, who's a philosopher who may or may not have endorsed it. It's very hard to say. But roughly this is the view that there's some threshold of probability, maybe 0.7 or 0.8 or 0.9, such that you're justified in believing something if it's pretty probable, if it's above 0.7, 70% probability. That's one view. Another closely related, though distinct view, is the thought that a belief is justified when it's a probable enough answer to the question that's asking. So in this sense, beliefs are sort of relative to questions. So here's one way to draw that out. Suppose there's a range of possible candidates for the Republican nomination. Trump, DeSantis, Pence, Nikki Haley, whatever, there's a bunch of them. No one has a majority of probability at this point. Suppose Trump is 40% likely by prediction markets to be the nominee, and DeSantis is 35%, and Haley is 20%, and Pence is 10%. So there's a bunch of candidates, none of whom are incredibly likely, but a natural thought is to say, well, look, to be justified in believing something is just for it to be likely enough relative to the alternative. So you might think, yeah, you're justified in believing Trump's going to win because he's the most likely competitor out of this field of whatever. Or maybe you think that's too unlikely, but you're at least justified in believing it's either going to be Trump or DeSantis. Well, that's got 80% probability or something like that, because it's so much more probable than the alternatives, even though it's possible that it depends. That's the sort of view which is one view that naturally goes with belief is weak, thinking that, well, relative to a given question, it's got to be a probable enough answer, or a set of answers that collectively are probable enough. And that's a view about which I quite like about when a belief is justified.
But I mean, when it comes to beliefs being justified, I know that there are different views out there, but do you think that people should only hold justified beliefs or not necessarily?
Depends a little bit what you mean by should there. So should is what the linguists call a deontic modal. A modal is about possibilities. A must, have to, should, can, those are all modals. And the classic observation about modals is they often have different flavors. So there are different considerations that may be in the background when we're saying should. So sometimes should, for example, has a moral flavor to it. You should give to charity, for example, and the sense in which you should give to charity is that it'd be morally good or meet your moral requirements. Right. Another sense is a sort of a thing is likely given the evidence, right? Something like Jim should be in the office by now. I haven't checked, but he should be in. It's past 9 a.m. Right? And that's not. I'm not saying morally you should be in the office. Maybe we work in a terrible company where it'd actually be morally better for them not to show up. But it's what I expect given my evidence. The relevant notion for epistemology often is thought there's something between those two. There's some should, which is like should in the sense of you're required to by some norms, but those norms are distinctively epistemic norms as opposed to moral norms. And so often people think, well, there's something like what you should believe given your evidence, what you should believe given the information you have. And that, in that sense, people, not everyone, but a lot of people will say, look, a belief is justified. That's to say the same thing as to say you should believe it given your evidence. It's this thing that's warranted given your evidence, you might think. And so in that sense, yes, you should, if you were meeting various epistemological ideals, you were being rational, that sort of thing, you should believe something whenever and only when it's justified. Of course, there are other notions, there are other flavors of should, though. So sometimes you should do something because it'll be good for you, or it'll be morally good, or it'll be in your interest. And in that sense, it can be the case that you should have beliefs that wouldn't be epistemically justified, right? So classic examples of this are like, maybe if I don't believe that I'm a good person, I'm just going to collapse in sort of a, apathy, and I won't be able to live a good life, and I'll become depressed and all the rest. Maybe I don't have very good evidence that I'm a good person. Maybe actually if I look at I look through my diary, there's a bunch of stuff I do that's I'm just an asshole, right? Could be that that's what my evidence warrants believing. Nevertheless, you might think there's a sense in which I should believe I'm a good person, because it'd just be so bad for me to come to admit that I'm a bad person, even if it's epistemically justified. It's the sort of thing that my evidence warrants. An impartial party would believe I'm an asshole. And there's a sense in which I shouldn't believe it because it'll be bad for me. And that's sometimes called a practical rationality or pragmatic considerations about what I should believe.
So it's complicated.
It's complicated.
So, changing topics, what is a higher order evidence?
So higher order evidence is a fun one, something I love, but it takes a little bit of work to get into it. So, let's start with some related notions that I think will be helpful to get it on the table. So, either rational or irrational person can have uncertainty about how the world's going to be. So you look on your weather app and it says there's a 70% chance of rain tomorrow. And so you're unsure whether it's going to rain tomorrow. Probably going to rain, according to that weather app. But you're not certain. It might rain, it might not. And so that might determine whether you bring an umbrella. It's likely enough that you will, but you're not going to cancel your trip because, 70% likely to rain. That's just regular uncertainty. Some forms of uncertainty seem epistemologically different. They are sometimes called higher order uncertainty, where you're not just uncertain about the state of the world, whether it's going to rain tomorrow, but you're actually uncertain about how uncertain you should be about the state of the world. So, to complicate the example, suppose you check your phone and it says 70% chance of rain, but then you look at some weather forecaster online and they say 30% chance of rain. Now you got a little bit of a problem here. What do I make of these two disparate sources that disagree on how likely it is to rain? And you might think, not only now am I uncertain whether it's going to rain tomorrow, I'm also uncertain exactly how uncertain I should be. I think, maybe I should be 70% confident it's going to rain tomorrow. Maybe I should be 30% confident. Maybe I'd be somewhere in the middle. Maybe I should be 50%. I should split the difference. Or maybe my phone's a little bit more reliable than that weather forecast. Maybe I should be 60%, that sort of thing. But I can be unsure exactly how confident I should be or how much uncertainty I should have. So that's what higher order uncertainty is. We're uncertain about how uncertain you should be. And then higher order evidence is information that can give you skew your opinions about how uncertain you should be, give you evidence about how you should react to your evidence, for example. So suppose, to extend the example one more time, I look at my phone, it says 70% chance of rain. I look online, it says 30% chance of rain. I think about these two for a little bit, and then I come to say, 65%. It's pretty likely to rain. Then my psychologist tells me, Kevin, you're always pessimistic about the weather. We've talked about this in the past. We know that you tend to just always assume the worst. You always sort of cancel plans early when actually it's like, it might be a good idea to keep them and that sort of thing. And like, if we look back at your track record, whenever you're really confident it's going to rain, often it's not very likely to rain. So they tell me that. Now that's higher order evidence in the sense that it gives me evidence that I have not properly responded to my evidence, right? In fact, I saw these two sources, I amalgamated them in a certain way. I went to 65% chance of rain, I thought, and my shrink tells me you have good reason to think that you're overconfident that it's going to rain, and that gives me evidence that suggests that my evidence actually warrants less confidence, maybe 50%, maybe 40%, that sort of thing. And so that's broadly speaking what higher order evidence is. Evidence about how you should respond to your evidence, or you should have already responded. Sometimes people say it's evidence about whether you've been rational or how it would be rational to deal with your information.
And what does it mean to be epistemically modest?
So this is a somewhat a term of art, but means it's concerned with relatively similar phenomena. So someone is modest in the sense I tend to talk about in my work. There are different senses floating around the literature, but the relevant sense is one in which they're unsure whether they're being rational, or they're unsure whether they're properly dealing with their evidence. And so in that sense, there's obviously a tight connection between higher order uncertainty and higher order evidence and modesty. Epistemic modesty is someone thinking like, maybe I'm not being fully rational now. That's the sort of thing that means you're going to be higher order uncertain. You're going to be uncertain how uncertain you should be often, and means you're going to be susceptible to higher order evidence about whether you're being rational. So maybe to take a contrast case. So the version of the case I just gave was one where I was implicitly epistemically modest. My shrink told me, you've been overconfident in the past. I took that to be reason to think I'm overconfident now, and so I became slightly less confident that it was going to rain. But I could have also been epistemically immodest. I could have thought, whatever my shrink tells me, I'm just going to ignore it because I don't think I've been irrational in this case. And that's another type of, I might have higher order attitudes, but think, yes, I've got the rational ones. I might look at 70% here and 30% here and say 65%. That's the right way to respond to my evidence. My shrink tells me I've been overconfident in the past. Well, maybe I've been overconfident in the past, but if I'm certain that 65% is the right response now, then what does that have to do with it? So that would be a sort of epistemically immodest response to higher order evidence, to sort of ignore higher order evidence. So roughly speaking, you're sensitive to higher order evidence when you're epistemically modest. You're insensitive to it when you're epistemically immodest.
And is there any problem with being epistemically modest, or can it be a problem?
A lot of people think there is, for different reasons. I think there's not. But yeah, let's walk you into some of the reasons why there might be and why why there might not be, and then vice versa. So why there might not be seems just intuitive in these sorts of cases. That, yeah, of course, it seems to make sense to be unsure how to respond to your evidence. It seems like you're being reasonable if you're unsure how to respond to your evidence. It seems, in fact, quite unreasonable in these sort of cases to think, look, I've messed up in the past, but I haven't messed up now. And so that's intuitive. One way to sort of get in the mindset of what this sort of picture can look like is to worry, well, you might think what's going on in that sort of case is there's different notions of rationality or reasonableness. It might be that sort of, look, if like there's being reasonable given my limitations, and then there's being ideally rational. And maybe what I'm doing in that sort of case is like, look, I'm being reasonable given my limitations, but I'm unsure what an ideally rational version of myself would think. Right? Now that might be called epistemic modesty, but that's not what people have in mind when they say epistemic modesty. What they mean is you are reasonable and unsure whether you're being reasonable, or you're rational and you're unsure whether you're being rational. Fix a normative notion like rational or reasonable given my limitations or what have you, and have uncertainty about whether you're conforming to that. A lot of people think that doesn't really make sense. How can sort of I be reasonable and wonder whether I'm being reasonable? It seems like it's got some circularity or something like, or it's got some like sort of hard to make sense of notion, but we can make sense of it with simple cases. So here's the case for why it should totally make sense, and then I'll give you the case for why it shouldn't make sense in a moment. Take an analogy. You and I are working on our homework problems. We're in a math class together, and one of us is harder. One of us is the diligent one. The other one is sort of slacked off a little bit, hasn't put in strong effort. We might, before we start talking, we sit down. I might wonder whether I'm the diligent one or whether you're the diligent one. I might wonder who's worked harder. You might wonder the same thing. You might wonder whether I'm diligent or you're diligent. Right? We might both wonder which one of us is the diligent one. Of course, by definition, one of us is. One of us has worked harder. So whoever that is, suppose it's you. That means that the person who's diligent doesn't know whether they're the person who's diligent. Right? The person who's worked hard needn't necessarily know that they've worked hardest. They can wonder whether someone else has. Because in fact, you're the one who's worked hardest, but in fact, you wonder whether I'm the one who's worked hardest. So that makes perfectly good sense. And of course, we can just import the analogy for rationality. Suppose you and I share evidence and we sit down and we're unsure which one of us has responded rationally to the evidence, right? I think maybe I have, maybe you have. You think maybe I have, maybe you have. Still, it could be that one of us has. It's just part of being rational is being unsure whether the other person has been rational, if that makes sense. So the thought is, higher order uncertainty or epistemic modesty makes sense just when a rational person can wonder whether they've in fact been rational. And of course, for many reasonable notions, like how diligent you've been, or how hard you've thought, or whether you've reflected sufficiently carefully, those are notions which seem like, of course, you can reflect sufficiently carefully and still wonder whether you reflected sufficiently carefully. That's the case that epistemic modesty makes sense. And that's the informal case, is a bunch of formal epistemology work of building models of this sort of phenomenon where we have effectively higher order probabilities that are unsure what the right probabilities are. And some of my work has been on making sense of that in a formal framework. So does that make sense? I can say more about that, or we can talk about why people think maybe even given that it doesn't make sense. But
talk about that second part then.
Great. So that's the case that it makes sense. The case that it doesn't make sense, there are a few different ways to get into it. One is to say, look, it's just too easy to fall into paradox with this notion of epistemic modesty. So extend the analogy again. You and I share evidence, and we're unsure which one of us is the rational one. Suppose in this case, I'm confident you're the rational one, and you're confident I'm the rational one, and one of us has been rational, in fact. Right? Then we've got a bit of a paradox on our hand, because whoever the rational person is, they're wrong. Right? If I was forced to guess, I would guess that you're the rational person and I'm not. And if you were forced to guess, you would guess that I'm the rational person and you're not. Whoever's rational, if it's me, then the rational person guesses wrongly that it's you. And if it's you, the rational person guesses wrongly that it's me. So that's the case of, you might think, too much modesty. Right? There are cases where maybe rational people can be unsure whether they're rational, but they can't be that unsure. They can't be such that they sort of incoherently think the other person is more rational than they are. Or maybe another way to put it is, suppose you had a choice between whether to defer to the rational person, whoever it is. Someone over there knows which one of us is rational, and he's going to sort of, make a decision for us based on those rational person's opinions. In this sort of extremely modest case, I don't want to defer to the rational person, whoever it is. I think the rational person is wrong. Here's a better person to defer to, the person who's 50-50 between us, because that person is more likely to guess right than the rational person who's guaranteed to guess wrong. Insofar as rationality is something we care about, insofar as we want to be rational, then you should think it's not the sort of thing that it's the sort of thing you should defer to. You shouldn't want to prefer the 50-50 person to the rational person. That's a sort of maybe a little bit overly abstract argument that once we allow rational people to be unsure whether they're rational, we're going to find ourselves with paradoxical results we don't like. That's one case. Maybe that might be a little bit too abstract. Here's another case that another argument that's been made for why we shouldn't allow, or we shouldn't think rational people can be modest. It's that effectively, if rational people can be modest, then there can be rational biases of a certain kind. Not the easiest thing to get clearly in view, but here's the formal fact and the general idea. So formally, when you build models of these things, and this is where the formal epistemology methodology comes in, you can just prove that models that allow epistemic modesty allow, in some sense, rational people to respond to their evidence in a skewed way, where effectively they can expect beforehand that they're going to go in a certain direction in their opinions. That they think, well, I might increase might become more confident, might become less confident, but on average, I think I'm going to become less confident. I sort of move in a predictable direction. And that looks like a form of bias. One way to sort of see it somewhat intuitively is to think of how people respond to arguments for their favored positions, take a politics case or whatever. You think abortion is morally permissible, imagine, then someone's going to give you an argument in favor of its moral permissibility. Right? Someone who's on your side is giving you an argument for something you believe. Now, if you're rational, you can't predict ahead of time that you're definitely going to become more confident that sort of abortion is permissible. If you could predict that, then you should already be more confident. You think, look, if I know I'm going to rationally increase my confidence of this thing, I should just now increase my confidence of this thing, because I think rational opinions are good opinions to have. So that sort of bias isn't allowed on modesty, but a more subtle form of bias is. You might think, look, if someone can give me an argument and they can manipulate basically how ambiguous it is, how hard it is for me to interpret, then they can make it such that if it's a good argument, if it's an argument that should increase my confidence, then it'll be very clear it's a good argument. I'll be able to tell, and I'll increase my confidence a lot that abortion is permissible. If it's a bad argument, it'll be hard to make sense of. It'll be like, I don't really know what to think of that. I'm really unsure what the rational response is. I'm really modest, so I don't move my opinions very much. Think of what a defense attorney does. What they do is they take the facts about their defendant and they say, they try to make the things that tell in favor of their innocence very clear. And you think, yes, definitely, he wasn't at the crime scene, according to this witness who seems reliable, and his fingerprints didn't quite match, and those are very clear bits of evidence for his innocence. And then the things that tell against his innocence, they try to make complicated and give you doubts about how to interpret them. Like, wow, I don't know, sort of another witness said he was there, but that witness seemed to say some other things that didn't make sense, and I'm not really sure how to make sense of that. And, so they try to make it such that the bits of evidence that point against the claim, it's unclear, you're modest about them. The bits of evidence that point in favor of the claim, they are clear, you're immodest about them, you know how to respond rationally. And if they do that, then they can bias you, right? Because they can make it such that, well, on average, when you see these bits of evidence coming in, when the evidence tells against innocence, it's going to be very weak because you're going to be really unsure how to interpret it. But when it tells in favor of innocence, it's going to be really strong. So you're going to, on average, you think, when this defense attorney stands up, they're going to probably convince me because I can expect, they're going to manipulate my epistemic modesty in this way. So that's maybe a long-winded way of saying that if we allow that rational people can be modest in this way, we're going to allow that there's some sense in which rational people can be biased as well. And people may not like that result, and that's one reason to be worried.
Right. So one last question then, because nowadays people have been talking a lot about that. Should we trust the experts, and is that an example of being epistemically modest or not?
Yeah, so there's a question about what it takes to defer to experts, what it takes to sort of be inclined to treat someone as sort of someone who you think has better beliefs than you, or think has more accurate beliefs, or think makes better decisions than you. And one puzzle that arises in this sort of vicinity is that if the expert is modest, if the expert is unsure that they're an expert, if the expert is rational but doesn't know that they're rational, for example, then there are various instances in which you can't fully defer to them. Here's a simple illustration. Suppose there are two potential experts, you and me, and someone is deciding whether to defer to us. Right? Now, I am immodest. I'm certain that I'm the expert. You are modest. You're 50-50 on whether me or you is the expert, right? And that seems like reasonable at a first pass. Suppose someone was trying to defer to you. They might defer to you on all sorts of things about sort of, I don't know, what you had for breakfast this morning and whether you're, a nice guy and so on. But here's one thing that they're not going to fully defer to you about: whether you're the expert. So, for example, suppose this person were to learn that the expert, whoever it is 50-50 that they're the expert, and the signs, would they be 50-50 that you're the expert? No, right? Because if I'm the expert, then the expert is certain that I'm the expert. If you're the expert is 50-50 that I'm the expert. So upon learning the expert is 50-50 that I'm the expert, they're going to learn one thing: I'm not the expert, it's you. Right? They should not be 50-50 that I'm the expert. They should be certain I'm not the expert, because here's something: if the expert is modest, then they don't know that they're expert. So if you learn some facts about the expert, you might learn things they didn't know. You didn't know that you were the expert, and so when they learn that you're the expert, they won't quite adopt that opinion. So that might sound like nonsense. It makes sense if we write it down a little bit more carefully, I guess. But the rough thought is, like, the standard ways for thinking about how to defer to experts don't make sense in a context where experts are modest, because when experts are modest, they don't know of their own expertise, and that can affect how you should defer to them. And this is where epistemology becomes formal in a way that I don't necessarily have the easiest way to gloss it informally, but there is work that I and some others have done on how is there a sense in which we can defer to experts who don't know of their own expertise? And the answer is yes, there are various senses in which we can. For example, you might not be disposed to fully adopt all their opinions about everything, like that example just gave, but you might adopt, enough of their opinions about enough things such that they are worth deferring to. So, for example, in that case, the person doesn't want to defer to you completely about whether you are the expert, but they do want to defer to you about, what you had for breakfast this morning. If they had to take a bet on whether you had Cheerios for breakfast this morning, they would like to outsource that to your opinions, right? For example, that's one sense in which they can defer to you. And there's a slightly more general sense as well, which is that if they, if they are unsure which one of us is of the experts, they split the difference. They're 75% confident that I'm the expert and 25% confident you are, because I'm certain I am, you're 50-50. They split the difference there. They might still think the expert's opinions, whoever they are more accurate than mine, even if they don't fully defer to them, right? So they think, well, look, either the expert is 1 or 50-50, 50%, 100% or 50%. Either way, if they're 100%, then 100% that Kevin's the expert, then Kevin is the expert, and the expert's more accurate than I am. If the expert is 50% that Kevin's the expert, then Kevin's not the expert, it's Ricardo. And that's still more accurate than I am, right? Because they're going to assign, the expert is more confident that Ricardo's the expert than I am, or the sort of third person is. That might not make sense, but the rough broad answer is there are various weaker senses of deference which make sense in the context of epistemic modesty. And one reason why that's interesting, maybe this is why should we care about this? Well, here's one answer. Insofar as there are good notions of deference to modest experts, we can also think about deference to our future selves as a way to think about what sorts of responses to evidence are rational. Here's one fairly standard story that people say: when do I think sort of responding to some evidence and changing my beliefs in certain ways is going to be rational? When I want to defer to those future opinions, when I think my future will be more accurate, when I think they'll make better decisions than I will. I don't want to defer to my future opinions if I'm going to be hypnotized, or if I'm going to forget things, or if I'm going to be irrational. But I do want to defer if I'm going to be properly processing evidence and getting more evidence. If we have a good notion of deference like that works in the case of epistemic modesty, then I'm going to put two things together. We already saw that when modesty can be rational, biases can be rational in a certain sense. And we already saw that even in the context of modesty, you can defer to people's opinions who are modest. Put those together and you might think, look, I agree I'm going to be biased in how I respond to this evidence. Nevertheless, I might still defer to my future self. I might still, it's rational, might still want to get that evidence, because I think something like, look, on average, I do think I'm going to be skewed in my opinions. I'm going to maybe go in one direction on average. But that's because I'm always moving towards the truth. I'm just going to move towards the truth asymmetrically. In the defense attorney case, you might think that's what happens. That, look, I do want to listen to the defense attorney. I don't want to just plug my ears, because I think they're going to give me good information. It's just that that information, if it tells in favor of innocence, is going to move me really strongly towards the accurate opinion. If it tells against innocence, it's going to move me a little bit against the accurate, a little bit in favor of the accurate opinion. On average, that's going to skew me, but still, it's evidence I want to get, you might think. And one big project I've been working on recently is how to connect all these highly theoretical questions to, empirical questions about the biased processing of evidence and so on. Whether we can make sense of various biases by thinking about ways in which people who are modest or unsure whether they're rational might nevertheless be rational, and despite being sort of skewed in the way they respond to evidence.
So, Dr. Dorst, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Sure. So you can go to my website, which is kevindorst.com, just my full name, or Google Kevin Dorst, and should show up somewhere around there. And there you'll find stuff about research, but also some more public writings that I've done, and sort of, there's a blog I keep about basically how the empirical evidence for irrationality and how strong it is, and arguing that it's less strong than people often think. So there you can find some stuff as well.
Great. So I will be leaving links to that in the description box of the interview, and thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show, and it's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, it was great to talk.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting me on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of this interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check the website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Perga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Ian Ricalania, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Wo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger, Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windegar, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Enguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernardini, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Ivan Bodrenko, Paul Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Haslem Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T., Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonho Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litzke, Dennis Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Todd Shackelford, Sunny Smith, and John Wiseman. My producers Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Luís Caetano, Tom Wagner, Dan Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus Francis, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.